told herself she wasn't afraid of him. She repeated it like a prayer the entire elevator ride up to his penthouse, but the moment the doors slid open and she saw the way he looked at her, slow, deliberate, like a man who already knew how the night would end. Every single word of that prayer dissolved on her tongue. Before we go any further, comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Seriously, drop your city or country down there, because this community is growing and I want to know who's here with me tonight. And listen, I know you could be literally anywhere on the internet right now. You could be watching cat videos, arguing in somebody's comment section, or falling asleep to a cooking show. But you chose to be here, and that genuinely means everything to me. So how's your day going? Be honest. Drop it in the comments. I want to know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because tomorrow's story, you will not forgive yourself for missing it. Now, let's get into this. Zara Collins had exactly 3 rules she lived by. Never mix business with pleasure. Never trust a man who smiled too easily. And never, under any circumstances, get into an elevator headed to the 40th floor of a building that didn't show up on any public registry in the state of Chicago. She had already broken all 3 tonight. She was 32 years old, a forensic accountant with a reputation sharp enough to cut glass, and she had spent the last 4 years of her career quietly unraveling financial crimes that powerful men thought they'd buried deep enough to never see daylight. She was good at finding things people tried to hide. She was even better at keeping herself hidden in the process. That discipline, that careful, calculated distance she kept between herself and anything that felt like real danger, was the reason she was still standing, still breathing, still whole. So she had absolutely no logical explanation for why she was standing in a private elevator, wearing a burgundy dress that fit her like a second skin, holding a manila folder she'd been told, in no uncertain terms, to deliver personally, tonight, by 9 o'clock. It was 8:57. The elevator smelled like sandalwood and something darker underneath it, something she couldn't name but felt in the base of her stomach like a warning she almost wanted to ignore. The mirrored walls threw her reflection back at her from every angle, and she found herself cataloging details the way she always did when she was nervous. The small gold hoops in her ears, the slight tremor in her left hand that she pressed flat against her thigh, the way her edges had started to curl slightly from the cold November air outside. She looked like herself. She told herself that mattered. The elevator stopped without a sound. The doors opened. And there he was. Daniel Ashford stood with his back half turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the Chicago skyline like a painting that cost more than most people's entire lives. He was dressed in a dark charcoal suit. No tie, top button undone. And he held a glass of something amber and expensive with the kind of relaxed ease that only came from a man who had never once in his life been caught off guard. He was tall in the way that made a room feel like it quietly rearranged itself around him without being asked. Broad shoulders, jaw cut clean and sharp, skin the deep rich color of dark mahogany that caught the low light of the penthouse and held it like he was made to stand exactly where he was standing. He turned when she stepped off the elevator. And that was the moment. That slow, unhurried turn, that gaze that moved over her. Not invasive, not disrespectful, just thorough, deliberate. The way a man looks at something he's already decided is worth his full attention, but is in absolutely no rush to act on it, like he had all the time in the world and fully intended to use every second of it. Zara's pulse did something she refused to acknowledge. She smoothed her expression before it could betray her and crossed the marble floor toward him, her heels making almost no sound at all, which she was grateful for because the last thing she needed right now was to announce her nerves through her footsteps. "Mr. Ashford." Her voice came out clean and professional. She was proud of that. "Zara Collins, I was told you were expecting these documents." She'd extended the folder. He didn't take it right away. He looked at her face instead, specifically her eyes, for just a beat longer than necessary, long enough that she felt the weight of it settle somewhere between her collarbone and her ribs, long enough that she had to actively resist the deeply unprofessional urge to look away first. She didn't, She held his gaze and lifted her chin by exactly the amount required to communicate that she was not the kind of woman who flinched. Something shifted in his expression, subtle, like he'd just noted something and filed it away. "You're not what I expected," he said. His voice was low, not soft. Low. Like thunder that was still a few miles out but was absolutely on its way. "And you're exactly what I expected," Zara replied, before the sensible part of her brain could intervene. One corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, more like the idea of one that he'd decided to keep private. He took the folder. His fingers grazed hers in the handoff. Barely, just a breath of contact. And Zara felt it move up her arm like something electric and completely unwelcome. She kept her face perfectly neutral. She was a professional. She had a graduate degree, a spotless track record, and a very structured approach to maintaining personal boundaries. She was also suddenly very aware of how quiet the penthouse was. "Sit down, Miss Collins," Daniel said, moving unhurriedly toward the bar cart near the windows. "There are things about this folder we need to discuss." She should have said no. She should have cited protocol, kept it clean and transactional, stepped back into that elevator and let the doors close between her and whatever this feeling was that was already starting to pull at the edges of her composure. Instead, she sat. Because the worst part, the part she wouldn't admit out loud to a single living soul, was that she wanted to know what he was going to say next. "Can I ask you something?" she said, watching him pour without looking at the glass the way people do when a place has become so familiar their hands just know it by heart. "You can try," he said, his back still to her. She almost smiled at that. Almost. "Why tonight? Why me specifically? My firm has other accountants with more seniority who could have handled a simple document delivery." He turned then, two glasses in hand, one extended toward her as he closed the distance between them with steps that were quiet and measured, and somehow made the large room feel significantly smaller. "Because the others," he said, setting her glass on the table in front of her, "aren't the ones who found what you found 6 months ago in the Hartwell account." Zara went very still. The Hartwell account. She hadn't spoken that name to anyone. She had buried her findings in a private file on an encrypted drive and told herself she needed more time before she decided what to do with what she knew. Nobody outside of that situation was supposed to know she'd been anywhere near it. She looked up at him slowly. Daniel Ashford lowered himself into the chair across from her with the unhurried stillness of a man who had never once in his life been on the wrong side of a room. He held his glass loosely, watching her with those dark eyes that gave away absolutely nothing and somehow said everything at the same time. "Who are you?" she asked. And this time, the steadiness in her voice cost her something. The corner of his mouth moved again, that same, almost smile that didn't quite arrive. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly the right question." The Chicago skyline burned behind him through 40 floors of glass, and Zara Collins, who had 3 rules and had shattered every single one of them before 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time begin to stir in the most inconvenient place imaginable. Her heart. She picked up the glass. Lord have mercy, she picked up the glass. Zara Collins had interviewed cartel accountants, sat across from corrupt senators, and once stared down a federal prosecutor who had tried to have her license pulled just to keep her quiet. She had never, not once, felt her hands go warm simply from sitting in the same room as a man. Until tonight. Until him. Daniel Ashford hadn't moved from his chair in 20 minutes, and somehow that stillness was the most unsettling thing about him. Most powerful men filled silence with noise, with ego, with performance, with the constant need to remind the room who they were. Daniel didn't do any of that. He just sat there, one ankle crossed over his knee, glass resting against his thigh, watching her with eyes so dark and steady they felt less like a gaze and more like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. Zara set her glass down with more control than she actually felt. "You said we needed to talk about what's in the folder," she said. "So talk." "I said we needed to talk about what's actually in it," he corrected, the distinction quiet but deliberate. "There's a difference. Enlighten me." He reached forward and opened the folder himself, spreading 3 documents across the glass coffee table between them. Zara recognized them immediately. Financial transfer records, shell company structures, routing numbers that looped back on themselves like a snake eating its own tail. She had seen documents like these before. She had built entire federal cases on documents like these. But these ones had names in them she recognized. Names that made her chest go tight. "Where did you get these?" she asked, and this time she couldn't completely scrub the edge from her voice. "The same place you got yours," Daniel said simply. "The Hartwell Group moves money through 7 different entities across 4 states. You found 3 of them." He tapped the documents. "I found all 7. Zara stared at the papers, then at him. "That's not public information." "No," he agreed. "It's not. Which means either you have someone on the inside or—" She stopped, looked at him again, differently this time. Slower. The suit. The penthouse that didn't exist on any public record. The way he'd known her name, her work, the specific account she'd touched 6 months ago and told absolutely no one about. "Or you're not just a businessman?" The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Daniel Ashford picked up his glass, took one slow sip, and set it back down with the calm of a man who had decided to let her arrive at the truth at her own pace rather than push her toward it. "The Hartwell Group," he said carefully, "is laundering money for people who will do far worse than ruin careers when they feel threatened. You got close enough 6 months ago that certain individuals took notice. I need to know exactly how much you documented and where you stored it." Zara felt the air in the room shift. Not dramatically, not like the movies, just quietly. The way a temperature drops right before a storm makes its intentions known. "Are you threatening me?" she asked. Her voice came out low and controlled, and she was deeply grateful for that. Something moved across his face, not offense, not amusement, something more complicated than either of those things, something that looked almost like it caused him effort to contain. "No," he said, and the word came out with a weight to it that felt like it meant something beyond its single syllable. "I'm the reason you haven't been threatened yet." The room went very quiet. Zara held his gaze and felt the statement settle into her like cold water, clarifying everything and complicating it all at the same time. She was a woman who prided herself on reading situations accurately, on knowing when to trust her instincts and when to question them. Right now, her instincts were doing 2 completely opposing things simultaneously, and neither of them were professional. Half of her wanted to stand up, retrieve her folder, and get back in that elevator so fast her heels would leave marks in the marble. The other half, the half she was deeply annoyed with, wanted to lean forward and ask him what exactly he'd done and why, and for how long, and whether the steady warmth in his eyes meant what she thought it might mean. She did neither. "You've been watching me," she said instead. "Monitoring the situation," he said. That's a creative way to say yes. For the first time, something that was genuinely close to a smile crossed his face, not the restrained almost version from earlier, an actual smile. Brief, real, and devastating in a way she absolutely was not prepared for. It changed his whole face, made him look for just a flicker of a second like a man rather than a monument. Zara felt that smile in her lower stomach and despised herself for it. "You're not scared," he observed, studying her with what felt like genuine curiosity layered under everything else. "I'm terrified," she said honestly. "I just don't find it useful to show it." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. A softening so slight she almost missed it, but she was trained to catch what people tried not to show, and what Daniel Ashford was trying not to show in that moment looked dangerously close to admiration. He stood, slowly, and crossed to the windows, standing with his back to her, hands loose at his sides, looking out at the city 40 floors below, like a man who owned pieces of it he'd never admitted to. "There are people who want what you know," he said quietly, "and people who want to make sure you never get the chance to use it. Tonight, you're somewhere in the middle of that, Ms. Collins, and the middle is the most dangerous place to be." Zara stood too. She wasn't going to sit and look up at him for this conversation. She crossed the room and stopped a few feet to his left, close enough that she could see his reflection ghosted in the glass beside hers. His tall frame, her burgundy dress, Two people who had no business being this close to each other, standing shoulder to shoulder, 40 floors above a city that would swallow them both without blinking. "And you?" she said, looking at his reflection rather than his face. "Where do you stand in all of this?" He turned his head toward her, just slightly, and in the glass she could see his eyes find hers the way they'd found them when she stepped off that elevator. That same slow, deliberate attention that felt less like being looked at and more like being read. "I stand between you and the people who want to use you," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, long enough that the city below filled the silence with its distant, indifferent light. "Because you're the only person who got close enough to the truth to actually matter," he said. "And because—" He stopped, just briefly, just enough for her to notice. "I don't want anything to happen to you." It was the pause before the second part that got her, that fractional hesitation. Because a man like Daniel Ashford didn't hesitate. Everything about him, the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he occupied a room, said he was a man who had made peace with every word before it left his mouth. That pause meant something. She turned to look at him directly then. No more reflections, just his face, close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, the careful architecture of a man holding something in place by sheer will. "Tell me who you really are," she said softly. Not as a demand, as something closer to a request. He looked at her for what felt like a very long time. Then he reached up, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and with one finger tucked a single loose curl behind her ear with a touch so careful it almost didn't register as touch at all. Almost. Zara's breath caught, quietly, but it caught. "I'll tell you everything," he murmured, his voice dropping to something that moved through her chest like a low chord. "But not tonight." "Why not tonight?" His hand dropped. He stepped back. Just enough. Just barely. And the distance he reintroduced between them felt like something being deliberately, painstakingly chosen. "Because tonight," he said, the low register of his voice doing something completely unfair to her composure, "if I start telling you everything, you'll want to leave, and I'm not ready for you to leave yet." Zara Collins stood 40 floors above Chicago in a dress the color of dark wine, looking at a man who was clearly dangerous, definitely complicated, and quite possibly the most magnetic human being she had encountered in her 32 years on this earth. She should have pushed. She should have demanded answers. Instead, she heard herself say, "Then you'd better pour me another drink." And the way Daniel Ashford's eyes moved over her face when she said it, slow, warm, and full of something that had absolutely no business existing between two people who had met less than an hour ago, told her that whatever she had just walked into, there was no clean way out of it. She wasn't entirely sure she wanted one anymore. And that right there, was the most dangerous thing that had happened all night. She should have left after the second drink. She knew it then, and she knew it now. Standing in the guest bathroom of Daniel Ashford's penthouse at 11:14 at night, cold water running over her wrists the way her mother had taught her to do whenever she felt overwhelmed and needed to come back to herself. Her mother had meant it for board meetings and difficult clients. She had absolutely not meant it for this. Zara looked at herself in the mirror, really looked, and had a brief, sincere, completely one-sided conversation with her own reflection about the series of decisions that had led her to this exact moment. The reflection did not have encouraging things to say. She had stayed. She had accepted a second drink and then somehow a third, and somewhere between Daniel explaining, in careful, measured language that told her he was choosing every single word, that he ran one of the most powerful private intelligence operations in the Midwest, and her realizing that the reason her Hartwell findings had never leaked was because he had personally intercepted the breach before it reached the people who would have used it against her. She had stopped thinking of him as a threat. That was the problem. He was absolutely still a threat, just a different kind than she'd originally cataloged. She turned off the water, pressed a towel to her wrists, and gave herself exactly 10 more seconds to locate her good sense. It did not show up. She walked back out. Daniel was at the kitchen island, jacket gone now, shirt sleeves rolled to the forearm in the particular way that had no business being as distracting as it was. He was reading through one of the documents from the folder, and the focused intensity on his face. That quiet absorption of a man who genuinely loved the architecture of information caught Zara somewhere she hadn't planned to be caught. She recognized that look. She wore it herself every time she sat down with a new case. She hadn't expected to recognize anything in him. That was what was quietly pulling everything apart. They talked, really talked, about the Hartwell Group, about the 7 shell entities, about the sister he'd lost 8 years ago to the same machinery they were both now circling from different directions. When he told her about his sister, he didn't dress it up or perform grief for her benefit. He just said it. Clean and quiet and heavy. And Zara felt it land in her chest like something that intended to stay. She didn't say she was sorry. She just held his gaze and let the silence carry what words couldn't. And somewhere in that silence, Daniel came around the island. Not rushing. Not with anything written on his face that she could easily file or categorize, just closing the distance between them with slow, unhurried steps until he was standing close enough that the warmth coming off his body reached her skin before he did. He said her name. Just that. Just Zara. Low and careful, like he'd been holding the weight of it all evening and was only now setting it down the way it actually wanted to rest. Something in her chest cracked open, quietly, like a window being eased up in a room that hadn't had air in a very long time. And when he told her, his voice dropped to something that barely qualified as sound. That he was not a gentleman, that he kept order in places the law didn't reach, that the people hunting her research were deeply afraid of him. Zara Collins made a decision in her body before her mind had fully signed off on it. She placed her hand flat against his chest, not pulling, not pushing, just. Her palm against the warmth of him, his heartbeat steady beneath her fingers, and the heat of his skin through the fabric of his shirt moving into her hand like something she hadn't known she'd been missing the feel of. His hand came up and covered hers, completely, gently, and then his lips found hers. The kiss started soft, almost unbearably soft, the kind of soft that wasn't timid but deliberate, like a man who understood that the most powerful thing he could do in that moment was not rush. His mouth moved against hers slowly, learning her, and Zara felt the restraint in it, felt him holding something back, and that knowledge, the awareness of the leash he was keeping on himself, sent heat cascading down her spine in a wave that made her fingers curl against his chest. She kissed him back, and that was when the leash loosened. His hand slid from hers up her arm to the curve of her shoulder, and then into her hair. Fingers threading through her curls with a sureness that made her breath stutter against his mouth. He angled her head back gently, deepening the kiss with the unhurried confidence of a man who had decided she was worth taking his time over, and Zara, who had kissed men before, who was not inexperienced or naive, felt the difference between this and everything that had come before it, like the difference between a match and an open flame. Her hands moved on their own, up his chest, to his shoulders, gripping the fabric of his shirt because she needed something to hold on to, and he was the only solid thing in the room. He made a low sound against her mouth, barely audible, deep in his chest, and it moved through her like a chord struck on an instrument she hadn't known she had inside her. He walked her back slowly, 1 step, 2, until her back met the edge of the island and he was pressed against her, one hand braced on the counter beside her hip, the other still cradling the back of her head like something precious, and the full warmth of him, the solid, overwhelming reality of his body against hers, pulled a sound from somewhere low in her throat that she would think about later with equal parts satisfaction and embarrassment. His mouth left hers. She nearly protested. She was not proud of how close she came to actually saying something. But his lips moved to her jaw instead, and then down the side of her neck, slow and purposeful, and Zara's head fell back against his hand and her eyes closed, and every carefully maintained professional boundary she had constructed over the last 4 years of her career simply, quietly, ceased to exist. His mouth on her neck was warm and unhurried, and he found a spot just below her ear that made her breath come out unsteady and her fingers tighten on his shoulders, and she felt him smile against her skin. Actually, smile, which told her he had absolutely noted that response and filed it away with the same precision he applied to everything else. "Daniel?" His name came out lower than she intended. Not a word, just acknowledgement, warm against her throat. This is... She stopped, tried again. We should, he agreed, his voice quiet and rough at the same time, lips still moving against her collarbone like he was in no particular hurry to address whatever point she hadn't quite managed to finish making. She laughed, softly, unexpectedly, and he lifted his head at the sound of it, looking at her from close range with something in his expression that was more disarming than anything else he'd done all evening. Something open and warm and real that had no armor over it at all. "You're laughing," he said, like it was the best thing that had happened to him in recent memory. "You're impossible," she told him. "You stayed," he said simply. She had no rebuttal for that. He straightened, slowly, but didn't step back. He stayed close, one hand moving from the counter to rest at her waist, light enough to be a question rather than an assumption, and looked at her with those dark eyes that had been unraveling her since the elevator and showed no signs of stopping. "Stay tonight," he said quietly. Not an order, not a negotiation, just an ask. Honest and uncomplicated in a way that hit harder than anything more elaborate could have. Not because of the folder or the Hartwell case or any of the rest of it, just... He paused. "Stay." Zara looked at him. At this man who ran shadows and kept order in the dark places of a city she thought she knew. This man who had a dead sister in a private war and the most careful hands she had ever felt in her life. This man who had kissed her like she mattered before she'd even decided whether she trusted him. Every sensible thing inside her said this was the moment to pull back, to smile politely, collect the folder, and put 40 floors of elevator between herself and whatever this was before it became something she couldn't undo. She reached up and straightened the already straight collar of his shirt, a small, private gesture, the kind you make with someone you've decided on. "I'll need a toothbrush," she said. Something moved across his face. Relief, maybe, or something warmer than that. And he pressed his lips to her forehead with a tenderness so quiet it bypassed every defense she had left and went directly to the center of her. "Third drawer, guest bathroom," he murmured against her hairline. "I had it put there this morning." Zara pulled back and looked at him. "This morning?" she repeated. That almost smile, the real one, the devastating one. "I told you," he said softly, his thumb tracing a slow, deliberate arc at her waist. "You were always the one they were going to send." She stared at him, processing, recalibrating, rearranging everything she thought she understood about tonight into a new shape that was both more alarming and, infuriatingly, more intriguing than the original. "We are absolutely," she said slowly, "going to talk about that." "Tomorrow," he agreed. "Tonight?" His hand at her waist pressed just slightly, warm and certain. And the look he gave her was the quietest, most unhurried, most completely consuming thing she had experienced in 32 years of living. "Tonight," he said, voice dropping to that low register that did unfair and unreasonable things to her entire nervous system. "I'm not interested in talking." Zara Collins, forensic accountant, 3-rule woman, careful keeper of her own heart, looked up at the most dangerous man she had ever been in a room with and felt every last carefully constructed wall inside her come down. Not crashing, not dramatically, just down. The way walls come down when something warm and inevitable finally leans against them long enough. She took his hand, laced her fingers through his, and let him lead her away from the kitchen island and the folder full of secrets and the Chicago skyline burning cold and bright behind the glass. What happened in the hours that followed lived in the territory that exists beyond words, in the language of skin and breath and the particular quality of silence that only exists between two people who have stopped pretending they don't want each other. He was thorough in the way that made time feel irrelevant, patient in the way that made her forget she'd ever been in a hurry about anything, and when the restraint he'd been holding all evening, finally, completely released. She understood, with her whole body and not just her mind, exactly what he had meant when he said he was not a gentle man. He was not. But he was careful with her in the way that mattered, attentive in the way that left no question unanswered, no moment unconsidered. He learned her the way he'd learned the Hartwell documents. Thoroughly, deliberately, like understanding her completely, was the only acceptable outcome. And Zara, who had spent 4 years keeping herself at a careful distance from anything that felt like real danger, lay in the gray hour before dawn in the warmth of Daniel Ashford's arms and made peace with the fact that she had never, not once in her life, felt anything that felt like this. Dangerous, real, hers. She was in so much trouble. She closed her eyes and decided to deal with it in the morning. She woke up to danger before she woke up to consciousness. Not dramatically, not with a scream or a crash. Just a feeling. That particular prickling awareness that moves across the back of the neck when something in the environment has shifted in a way the sleeping brain registers before the waking one catches up. Zara's eyes opened. The penthouse was gray with early morning light, that particular shade of Chicago dawn that looked like the city was still deciding whether to commit to the day. The sheets beside her were warm but empty. Daniel was already gone from the bed, and the absence of him, the cool space where all that warmth had been, registered in her body before she fully understood it. She sat up slowly, and immediately became aware of 3 things. 1. She felt different in her own skin than she had yesterday. Not uncomfortably, just differently. Like a room that had been rearranged in the night and was still the same room, but nothing sat quite where it used to. 2. There were voices coming from somewhere beyond the bedroom door. Low, tense. The specific register of men who were trying to keep a conversation contained and failing slightly at the edges. 3. Her folder was gone from the coffee table where she'd left it. Zara was out of bed in 12 seconds flat. She found a folded white dress shirt on the chair by the window. His, left there deliberately, she realized, because it was folded too neatly to have been forgotten. And she put it on with the efficiency of a woman who had stopped being embarrassed about practical decisions approximately 4 years ago. It hit her mid-thigh. It smelled like sandalwood, and something that was just him. She noted that fact, filed it under dangerous, and moved on. She cracked the bedroom door open. Daniel was in the main room, still dressed. Had he slept at all? Standing with 2 other men she had never seen before. One was built like a defensive linebacker who had recently committed fully to the lifestyle, wearing a dark jacket that did absolutely nothing to conceal the fact that he was armed. The other was leaner, quieter, with the watchful stillness of someone trained in a particular kind of attention that Zara recognized from her years of working adjacent to federal investigators. Neither of them looked like they were delivering good news. Daniel had his back partially to the bedroom, but his posture, the set of his shoulders, the way his hands were loose at his sides, and the careful, deliberate way of a man controlling his own tension, told her the conversation was serious. She caught fragments. Moved faster than we anticipated. 3 of the accounts flagged simultaneously, which means they know someone. She's a problem now, whether you want her to be or not. That last one landed like cold water. Zara pushed the door open and walked out. All 3 men turned. The linebacker's hand moved toward his jacket instinctively before Daniel's sharp single look stopped at mid-motion. The lean one simply observed her with an expression that gave nothing away. Daniel looked at her for exactly 1 second. Just one, but it was full. And she watched him rapidly process the situation and make a decision about it. "Give us a minute," he said to the other 2. The linebacker looked like he had opinions about that. He kept them to himself, and both men moved to the far end of the room with the particular discretion of people who were very good at pretending they couldn't hear everything. Daniel crossed to her. He stopped close. Not as close as last night, but close enough that his voice could stay low between them. "You heard," he said. "Enough," she replied. She kept her voice steady. "Someone flagged the accounts. They know someone has been inside the Hartwell records, and your colleague over there just called me a problem." She met his eyes. "So I need you to tell me, right now, with no careful wording, exactly how much danger I am in this morning." Daniel looked at her for a moment, and she could see him weighing it. The instinct to manage information against something else, something that had developed over the course of the previous evening and clearly complicated his usual approach. He chose honesty. "Significant," he said quietly. "The Hartwell Group had a monitoring protocol on their accounts. When you accessed them 6 months ago, you triggered a flag that went dormant. They assumed the breach was contained. Last night, when I pulled the full documentation to show you, it re-triggered." He paused. "They now know someone with high-level access is actively building a case." Zara absorbed that. "And they'll come after the source. They always do. Which means they'll come after me." "They'll try," he said. And the way he said it. Flat, certain, with absolutely no performance in it. Told her that he meant it as a statement of fact about what he would prevent, not a reassurance designed to make her feel better. She appreciated the difference more than she could articulate at that particular moment. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "you don't go back to your apartment. You don't go to your office. You don't contact anyone from your firm until we've controlled the exposure." He held her gaze. "And you stay close to me." Zara looked up at him. In the gray morning light, without the softness of the previous evening, without the amber glow of the penthouse lamps, he looked exactly like what he was. A man built for high stakes and difficult decisions, carrying a history that had shaped him into something that operated in the space between law and necessity. He also looked like the man who had pressed his lips to her temple last night, like she was something worth being careful with. She was having significant trouble separating those two things. "Staying close to you," she said slowly, "is what got me into this." "No," he said. "The Hartwell case got you into this. I'm what's going to get you out." He paused. One beat. "Those are two different things, Zara." Her name again. That same careful weight. Her traitorous nervous system responded to it the same way it had last night, which was deeply inconvenient given the circumstances. "I need my laptop," she said, because she needed to say something practical before her body made any more independent decisions. "If they have triggered the monitoring protocol, there are encrypted files on my personal drive that could—" "Already retrieved," he said. She stared at him. "Excuse me?" "Marcus." He nodded toward the lean, quiet man across the room. "Went to your apartment at 5 this morning. Your laptop, your external drive, and your go bag from the closet shelf behind your winter coats." He said it matter-of-factly, like this was entirely normal information to have about a woman he had met less than 12 hours ago. Zara opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "How did you know about the go bag?" she said. "I've never told anyone about the go bag." "You're a forensic accountant who has spent 4 years building cases against dangerous people," he said simply. "I'd have been more surprised if you didn't have one." She stared at him for a long moment. "I cannot decide," she said carefully, "whether you are the most prepared man I have ever encountered or the most terrifying." "In my experience," he said, "those aren't mutually exclusive." She would have laughed. It was funny. It genuinely was. Except that the linebacker across the room chose that exact moment to clear his throat in the manner of a man who was trying very hard not to exist but needed to. Daniel glanced over his shoulder. His expression shifted. Back to that controlled, operational stillness. And he looked at Zara one more time before he had to move back into whatever this morning was going to require of him. "Get dressed," he said quietly. "There are clothes in the second closet." "Don't ask," he added, reading her face. "Yes, I had them sent up this morning too. We need to move within the hour." He started to turn. She caught his wrist. Not hard, just her fingers around his wrist, and the contact stopped him completely. He turned back and looked at her hand and then at her face with an expression that was entirely unguarded for exactly 1 second before everything else settled back over it. "Last night," she said quietly. Not accusatory, just direct, the way she did everything. That was real. That wasn't strategy. It wasn't a question, but she needed him to confirm it. Something moved through his eyes, that warmth, the one he didn't perform, the one that simply existed underneath everything else and surfaced in moments he apparently couldn't fully prevent. He turned his hand over in her grip and closed his fingers around hers. "The most real thing that's happened to me in 8 years, he said low. And then, because he was apparently determined to systematically dismantle every remaining defense she possessed, he lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles. Slow, warm, unhurried, while 2 armed men stood 20 feet away pretending to study the carpet. Zara felt that kiss move all the way from her hand to somewhere deep in her chest and take up residence. She was absolutely in love with him. The thought arrived fully formed, uninvited, and horrifyingly certain. It had been less than 24 hours. She was a forensic accountant, not an impulsive person, and she was fairly sure this qualified as some kind of clinical event that a professional should assess. She said none of this. She simply looked at him and said, "Go handle your morning. I'll get dressed." He held her gaze for one more moment, reading her the way he read everything, thoroughly and completely. And whatever he found there made the corner of his mouth move in that private way that she had already, in less than a day, come to feel was hers specifically. He let go of her hand and turned back to his men. Zara walked back to the bedroom, closed the door, and stood in the middle of the floor in Daniel Ashford's shirt in the gray Chicago morning, and pressed both hands flat against her sternum, where her heart was doing things that bore absolutely no resemblance to its normal behavior. She was in danger. From the Hartwell group, yes. From the people who were now aware that their network was being unraveled, certainly. But the danger she was standing in the middle of right now, the one she could feel in every nerve ending and every too-quick heartbeat, had nothing to do with shell companies or dirty money. It had dark eyes and careful hands and a mouth that had spent the better part of the night learning every single thing about her that she had spent years trying not to let anyone close enough to know. She got dressed. She was going to need every single one of her wits today, and most of them were still scattered somewhere between last night and this particular irreversible morning. God help her. She pulled on the clothes he'd had sent up. Dark, practical, perfect fit, because, of course, and looked at herself in the bedroom mirror one more time. She looked like a woman who had made a decision she couldn't unmake. She looked exactly right. They moved her to a safe house by 10 in the morning. Not a dingy television movie safe house with peeling wallpaper and a single bare bulb swinging from the ceiling. This was Daniel Ashford. So the safe house was a 4-story brownstone in Lincoln Park with heated floors, a kitchen stocked like someone actually intended to live there, and windows fitted with glass that Zara was fairly certain could stop a bullet without flinching. She noted all of this, filed it, said nothing. She was getting better at saying nothing around him, which concerned her because Zara Collins had built her entire professional identity on asking the uncomfortable question at the exact moment people least wanted to answer it. Silence was not her natural habitat. But something about Daniel made her want to watch before she spoke, to observe, to collect him the way she collected evidence, carefully, completely, without disturbing the scene. Marcus, the lean, quiet one, had swept the brownstone and left within 20 minutes of their arrival. The linebacker, whose name turned out to be Deshaun, and who had, in the SUV ride over, revealed himself to be surprisingly funny in the dry, completely deadpan way of someone who had decided long ago that humor was the only sane response to his particular occupation, was stationed on the ground floor, which left Zara and Daniel alone on the second floor with her laptop, his files, 2 cups of coffee that he'd made himself without asking how she took hers and had somehow gotten exactly right, and the particular charged quiet of 2 people who had been extraordinarily intimate with each other and were now pretending to focus on work. It was not entirely successful pretending. They spread everything across the dining table, her encrypted files, his 7-entity map of the Hartwell network, financial records dating back 11 years that Daniel had clearly been building with the patience and precision of someone who understood that the most airtight cases were the ones that took the longest to construct. Zara looked at the full picture for the first time and felt the specific chill that moved through her whenever she stood at the center of something genuinely large. This wasn't a mid-level laundering operation. This was a machine. Sophisticated, layered, with tendrils that reached into city contracts, federal procurement channels, and at least 2 names she recognized from Chicago's most prominent philanthropic circles. They've been doing this for over a decade, she said quietly. 11 years, 4 months, Daniel said from beside her, close enough that his arm brushed hers as he leaned over the table to point at a specific routing sequence. The first clean transaction I can trace back to the original source is from 2013, Zara finished, her finger landing on the same document a half second after his. They both looked at their hands. nearly touching on the same page, and the awareness moved through the air between them like a current that had been running underneath the professional surface of the last 2 hours, waiting for exactly this moment to make itself known. Daniel straightened slowly. Zara did not move her hand. "You found the same origin point," he said. His voice had shifted slightly, lower, the work voice and the other voice beginning to blur at the edges the way they had last night. "I found it 6 months ago," she said, eyes still on the document. "I didn't know what to do with it." "Why not?" She looked up at him then. He was closer than she'd realized. Or maybe he'd moved, or maybe she had, because proximity to this man seemed to operate by its own physics, governed by rules she didn't fully understand yet. His eyes were on her face with that total, patient attention, and the morning light coming through the reinforced windows caught the angles of him in a way that made her want to put down the documents and do something significantly less productive. "Because the people connected to it," she said carefully, "included my firm's second largest client." The silence that followed was significant. "Zara." "I know." "That means someone inside your firm." "I know, Daniel." She held his gaze. "I've known for 6 months, and I've been sitting on it because the moment I moved on it, I was going to be alone in it. No institutional backing, no protection." She paused. "No one who knew what I knew and had the means to do something about it." He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched something move through his expression. Something complex and layered that started as what looked like frustration and arrived at something much softer than that. "You should have come to me sooner," he said quietly. "I didn't know you existed sooner." "You would have found me," he said, with the absolute simple certainty of someone who believed it completely. "You were always going to find me, Zara. You were moving toward this, toward all of it, from the moment you pulled that first Hartwell record." She stared at him. That statement, the weight of it, the intimacy of it, the way it sounded less like arrogance and more like something he'd thought about enough to be certain of, moved through her chest in a slow, deep wave. "That's a lot of confidence," she said softly. "That's pattern recognition," he said, but his eyes were warm when he said it. And warm on Daniel Ashford was a thing that happened in her body before it happened in her mind. She turned back to the documents, self-preservation instinct, fragile but present. "We need to establish which of the 7 entities is the primary pressure point," she said, reaching for her coffee. "If we can freeze the central routing account, the others become traceable in a way that survives legal scrutiny. The evidence has to be clean. It has to hold up." "Agreed," he said, settling into the chair beside her. Not across, beside, close enough that his knee rested against hers under the table, with a casual, easy contact that was somehow more intimate than it had any right to be given the current subject matter. She did not move her knee. Neither did he. They worked for 2 hours like that, side by side, knees touching, building the case with the focused, collaborative rhythm of 2 people who turned out to be extraordinarily well matched in the way their minds moved through problems of her precision with numbers, his breadth of contextual knowledge, the way they finished each other's analytical threads without fumbling the handoff. It was, Zara thought, one of the most unexpectedly attractive things she had ever experienced, which said something about her that she chose not to examine too closely at present. The call came at 12:47. Daniel's phone. He looked at the screen and something in his jaw tightened. Subtle, controlled, but she caught it. "I need to take this," he said. "Take it," she said. He stepped away from the table, and Zara kept her eyes on the documents, but she listened the way she always listened, with her whole body catching tone and cadence even when she couldn't catch words. The call was short, less than 2 minutes. When he came back to the table, his expression was composed, but his energy had shifted. That quiet, operational stillness that she was learning meant he was managing something significant. "Talk to me," she said. He sat, looked at her directly. "The Hartwell Group has identified you by name. They know you're the source." He paused. "They've made contact with someone inside the Chicago field office of the FBI, someone who owes them." The room felt smaller. "They're going to try to flip the investigation," she said. "Make it look like I'm the criminal." "They're going to try," he said. Same tone he'd used this morning. Flat. Certain. The tone that meant he had already decided what he was going to do about it. Daniel. She leaned forward. If they have someone inside the FBI that changes the exposure level significantly, that means... It means we move the timeline up, he said. We file everything by end of business today. Not through your firm, not through any channel they've had time to compromise. He met her eyes. I have a federal contact, clean. Someone who has been waiting for exactly this package for 2 years. You've been building toward this moment for 2 years, she said slowly. Yes. And I walked into your penthouse last night with the last piece. Yes. She sat with that for a moment, all of it. The scope of what he'd built, the patience it had required, the specific precision with which she had arrived at exactly the right moment, carrying exactly what he needed. And then, the thing she needed to ask, the thing she had been not asking since 5 this morning when she'd stood in the bedroom in his shirt. Daniel. Her voice was quiet, but her eyes were steady. Last night, before everything, before I knew any of this. She held his gaze. Did you feel any of it? Or was I a variable you needed to keep cooperative? The question cost her something to ask. She felt it leave her. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. And then he did what he had done consistently since the elevator. He chose the truth over the easier option. He reached across the table and took her face in both hands. Slowly. Deliberately. His thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with a tenderness that contradicted every dangerous thing she knew about him, and somehow, because of that contradiction, hit harder than anything else could have. Every single thing that happened last night, he said, his voice dropping to that low register that lived in her chest like a resident, happened because I could not stop it from happening, not because I planned it. His eyes held hers close and steady. I have planned many things in my life, Zara. I have never once planned to feel anything. Feeling things is not convenient for a man in my position. And yet, she said softly. And yet, he agreed. He leaned in and kissed her, slow and deep and with the particular quality of a kiss that wasn't building toward anything except itself. Just the two of them, at a table covered in evidence of a decade of crime, in a safe house with bulletproof windows, acknowledging something that had no convenient place in either of their lives and existed anyway. When he pulled back, she kept her eyes closed for 1 extra second. Okay, she said finally. Okay, he repeated. I believe you. She opened her eyes. Don't make me regret it. Something moved across his face. Warm and private and entirely hers. I won't, he said. And then his phone buzzed again, and the warmth closed back over, and Daniel Ashford became operational again, and Zara Collins straightened in her chair and pulled the documents back in front of her because they had a case to finish building and people who wanted them both silenced, and approximately 6 hours before everything came to a head. But his hand found hers under the table, and it stayed there. Through the next call. Through the cross-referencing of accounts, through the careful, painstaking construction of a case that was going to bring down people who had believed for 11 years that they were untouchable. His hand stayed in hers the entire time. And that, more than the penthouse and the kiss and the dress shirt and the perfect cup of coffee and every devastating thing his mouth had done the night before, was what broke the very last wall Zara Collins had been keeping between herself and the terrifying, exhilarating, apparently unavoidable truth of what she felt for this man. She loved him. 11 years of Hartwell records on the table in front of her, armed men downstairs, a corrupted FBI agent somewhere in the city with her name on a list, and she was sitting in a Lincoln Park safe house falling completely, irrevocably in love with the most dangerous man in Chicago. She looked at their joined hands on the table. She had absolutely no regrets. That was perhaps the most alarming thing of all. She heard the first shot at 3:47 in the afternoon. Not close, 2 floors below, but in a house that had been deliberately, professionally silent for the last 4 hours, the sound split the air like a crack in the foundation of everything they'd built since morning. Zara was on her feet before the echo finished. Daniel was already moving. He came out of the side room where he'd been on a call, and the transformation was immediate and complete. The man who had held her hand under the table and pressed his mouth to her knuckles and looked at her like she was the most significant thing in any room he'd ever occupied was still there, somewhere underneath. But what was on the surface now was something else entirely, something cold and precise and extraordinarily controlled. He crossed to her in 4 steps, gripped her upper arm. Not hard, but firm, the grip of someone who needed her to move exactly when he said move, and put his mouth close to her ear. "Stay behind me," he said. "Don't speak. Don't stop. Whatever you see, keep moving." "Deshawn," she started. "I know," he said. 2 words that carried everything they needed to carry. She grabbed her laptop and the external drive off the table. Instinct, pure and absolute, years of knowing that the work was the thing. And she followed him. The stairwell was clear. Daniel moved through it with a fluency that told her, fully, finally, without any remaining ambiguity, that this was not a man who had learned how to handle danger. This was a man who had been built by it. He moved like someone for whom threat assessment was as natural and automatic as breathing, his body low and efficient, one hand extended back to keep contact with her as they descended. Zara kept her breathing steady and her feet quiet and did not let herself think about anything except the next step. It was a technique she'd developed in her professional life for moments. When the numbers on a page revealed something so dangerous, her instincts told her to run. You narrowed your world to the immediate, the next breath, the next step, the next decision. She was very good at it. They reached the first-floor landing. Deshawn was alive. She registered that first with a relief that nearly buckled her knees. Pressed against the wall beside the front door with his weapon drawn, a neat dark graze along his left forearm that he was treating with the casual resignation of a man who had decided that particular injury did not qualify as a real problem. 2 outside, he said low. 1 already inside. I handled it. They came through the service entrance. His eyes moved to Zara briefly. They know exactly where we are. The FBI leak, Daniel said. Has to be. Daniel was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Zara had been with him long enough now to know that 3 seconds of Daniel Ashford's silence contained more processing than most people accomplished in an hour. Back exit, he said. Car in the alley. Marcus is 30 seconds out. He looked at Deshawn. Hold the front until we're clear. Deshawn nodded once, already turning back to the door, and said, entirely to the wall, "This is why I asked for hazard pay." Despite everything, Zara almost smiled. Daniel's hand found the small of her back in the touch. Warm, solid, purposeful. Moved through her like a current even in the middle of all of this, even now, even here. Her body had apparently decided that its response to Daniel Ashford operated completely independently of circumstance, which was both inconvenient and, she was starting to think, entirely permanent. They moved through the kitchen to the back of the house. He stopped at the door, looked at her. "You trust me?" he said. Infuriatingly, she said. Something quick and real moved across his face. He pushed the door open. The alley was gray and cold, and Marcus was exactly where he said he'd be, engine running on a black SUV that looked ordinary enough to be invisible and was almost certainly anything but. They were inside and moving within 20 seconds of clearing the door, and Zara sat in the back seat beside Daniel with the laptop against her chest and her heart doing a full sprint against her ribs, and told herself firmly that she was fine. She was fine. She was absolutely fine. Daniel's hand came to her knee, steady, warm, not speaking. There wasn't space for that yet. Marcus was on comms in the front, navigating them through a route that avoided every obvious surveillance point with a precision that suggested it had been planned well in advance. But the weight of his hand on her knee said everything that the moment didn't have room for in words. She put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. They rode like that through 15 minutes of Chicago streets while the city moved around them with its complete indifferent normalcy. People walking dogs, a food truck on a corner, traffic cycling through a light. And the absurd contrast of all that ordinary life flowing past the windows of a vehicle carrying 2 people who had just left a safe house through a back door ahead of armed men made Zara's chest tight with something that was equal parts adrenaline and a kind of sharp, piercing awareness of how much she did not want to lose what she had found in the last 24 hours. She looked at Daniel's profile. He was watching the road, the city, everything at once, his jaw set and his mind clearly already 3 moves ahead. But his fingers were still wrapped around hers, firm, present, certain. She looked back at the road. She was not going to cry in this car. She was a forensic accountant who had just walked through an active threat situation with her evidence intact and her dignity mostly assembled. She was not going to cry. She didn't cry. Marcus drove them to a building in the West Loop that had no signage and a parking structure that descended 4 levels underground. They took the elevator up to what appeared to be a legitimate financial consulting firm. Reception desk, tasteful art, the quiet hum of a real working office. And through a secondary door that required Daniel's handprint to a set of rooms behind it that were clearly the actual operation. Screens, multiple. Feeds from cameras across the city, a server room visible through glass, 2 people at workstations who looked up when they entered and immediately looked back at their screens with the practiced focus of people who understood that some arrivals were above their clearance level to acknowledge directly. Zara stopped in the middle of the room and looked at all of it. "This," she said, "is not a private intelligence operation." "No," Daniel agreed, coming to stand beside her. "It's not." "What is it?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he turned to face her fully, and the look on his face was the look she had learned to recognize as the one that preceded the truest thing he was going to say. "It's everything I built after my sister died," he said. "It started as revenge. It became infrastructure. I have contracts with 3 federal agencies that officially don't exist. I have people in 12 cities. I've been building a case against the Hartwell Group specifically for 2 years. He held her gaze. "And now I have you. And what you carried into that elevator last night is the last piece that makes all of this legally unassailable." Zara looked at him for a long moment. "You run a shadow intelligence agency," she said. "Essentially." "Funded by?" "Asset recovery, seized funds from operations we've dismantled. And the mafia connections that your friend Deshawn is clearly not anxious about." Something moved through his eyes, that careful wait. "The people I work with operate outside conventional systems. Some of them have histories that wouldn't survive public scrutiny. I make no apologies for the alliances I've built." He paused. "But I have never, not once, used what I have to hurt anyone who didn't choose that world deliberately." "Your sister didn't choose it," Zara said quietly. "No," he said. "She didn't." The room was quiet except for the distant sound of keyboards and the low hum of servers. Zara set her laptop on the nearest desk. She crossed to him. She placed both hands flat on his chest the way she had the night before. That same gesture, already theirs, already something that belonged to the specific private language of them. And looked up at his face. "I'm going to help you finish this," she said. "Not because I'm scared, not because I need your protection, not because you have people with guns. Because what's in my files and what's in yours together will put every person responsible for what happened to your sister. And to every other person this machine has swallowed. Away for the rest of their lives." She held his gaze. "That's worth doing. I want to do it with you." Daniel looked at her with an expression she felt in every layer of herself. He pulled her in. Not gently, not tentatively. He pulled her against him the way a man pulls someone when he's done pretending he doesn't need to. His arms wrapping around her with a completeness that pressed her fully against the warmth of his chest, his face dropping to the top of her head, his whole body exhaling a way she could feel through her hands and her cheek and every point where they connected. She wrapped her arms around his waist and held on. They stood like that in the middle of his operation center while the screens flickered with the city's surveillance feeds and the keyboards clicked and the world outside continued doing the dangerous, complicated things it did. And for just that moment, everything contracted to the space of his arms and the sound of his heartbeat under her ear and the particular peace of being exactly where she was supposed to be. "Zara," he said against her hair, low, rough at the edges. "I know," she said. "I need you to know that after this," he stopped, started again. "When this is done, I need there to be something after this, with you. Something that isn't a safe house or a document or a threat we're managing together." She pulled back enough to look at his face. "Are you asking me something?" she said. "I'm telling you something," he said. "I'm telling you that I have spent 8 years making sure nothing could touch me that mattered enough to be used against me." His eyes held hers. "And then you walked off that elevator in that burgundy dress and ruined my entire system in approximately 45 minutes. She stared at him. 45 minutes? She said. That's all it took?" "You were thorough," he said, and the way he said it. Dry, warm, entirely real. Made her laugh, actually laugh, fully, right there in the middle of all of it. And Daniel Ashford, dangerous, careful, fortress-built Daniel, smiled back at her with his whole face, not the corner, not the almost, his whole face. It was extraordinary. She reached up and pulled him down to her and kissed him with everything the day had put in her. The fear and the adrenaline and the relief and the certainty and all of it. And he kissed her back with matching thoroughness, his hands moving up her back and into her hair, unhurried and complete, until someone in the room cleared a throat that was definitely Marcus and definitely being ignored. When they finally broke apart, both of them slightly breathless, his forehead rested against hers. "Let's go finish this," she said softly. "Together," he said. "Together," she agreed. She turned back to the desk and opened her laptop. And Daniel Ashford. Mafia connected, shadow agency running, 8 years of careful distance, Daniel Ashford. Pulled his chair so close to hers that they were sharing the same warmth again, exactly the way they'd sat all morning at the safe house table. Knee to knee. Hand finding hand between keystrokes. Two people building something out of evidence and danger, and the particular stubborn, irrevocable thing that had ignited between them in less than 24 hours and showed absolutely no signs of burning out. Outside, Chicago moved through its gray November afternoon, indifferent and vast. Inside, they built the case that would end it. The Hartwell group fell on a Thursday. Not with an explosion. Not with a dramatic standoff or a car chase through Chicago streets. It fell the way the most powerful things fall when someone has been patient enough and thorough enough and angry enough to do it properly. Quietly, completely, and with the kind of documentation that left absolutely no room for lawyers to find daylight. By 4 in the afternoon, federal marshals had executed simultaneous arrests across 3 states, 11 individuals, 4 of them names that would be on the front page of every major newspaper in the country by morning. 2 of them names that had appeared on the donor walls of Chicago's most prestigious institutions for the better part of a decade. The corrupted FBI agent was arrested at his desk. Zara watched the confirmation come through on Marcus's screen from across the room and felt something release inside her chest that she hadn't fully realized she'd been holding for 6 months, maybe longer, maybe since the first moment she'd pulled that Hartwell record and understood. And the way her body understood things before her mind caught up, that she had found something that was going to change the shape of her life. She just hadn't known it would change it like this. She hadn't known it would change it into him. Marcus turned from the screen and looked at Daniel with the particular expression of a man who had been through too much with someone to perform anything other than the truth of the moment. Something quiet and significant passed between them. Not words, just the acknowledgement of 2 people who had been working toward the same destination for a very long time and had finally, completely arrived. Then Marcus looked at Zara. "You're the reason this held," he said simply. "Without your documentation, we had circumstantial. With it, we had everything." He paused, and something that was almost a smile moved across his usually unreadable face. "Welcome to the team, I suppose." "That's the warmest thing you've ever said to anyone," Daniel said from beside her. "Don't push it," Marcus said, and turned back to his screens. They left the building at 6. Just the 2 of them. Daniel had sent Marcus and Deshawn ahead. Deshawn had made exactly one comment about his arm requiring medical attention and a steak dinner as compensation, received 0 sympathy, and left satisfied regardless. And now it was just Zara and Daniel stepping out into the Chicago evening with the cold November air hitting her face like a clean, clarifying hand. She stopped on the sidewalk and just breathed. In and out. The city around her. The smell of cold air and distant food, and the particular electricity of an urban evening settling into itself. She tipped her face up toward the sky, which was doing something extraordinary, in shades of deep violet and burnt amber at the edges where the sun had recently made its exit. She felt Daniel stop beside her. He didn't speak. He just stood there with her and looked up at the same sky and let the moment be what it was. "It's over," she said. Not a question, just saying it out loud because it needed to exist as a spoken thing. "It's over," he confirmed. She lowered her face and looked at him in the evening light. All that violet and amber moving across his features, he looked different than he had in every other light she'd seen him in. Not softer exactly. More settled. Like something he'd been carrying at a particular angle for 8 years had finally been set down, and his body was still learning what it felt like to stand without that weight. She reached up and touched his jaw, just her fingertips, the slight roughness of end-of-day stubble against her skin. He turned his face into her touch the way people do when they're tired enough to stop pretending they don't need things. "How are you?" she asked softly. He thought about it. Actually considered the question rather than deflecting it, which she had learned in 24 hours was not something Daniel Ashford did easily or often. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I've been moving toward this for so long that I'm not sure I know what standing still feels like." He looked at her. "Ask me again in an hour." "Where will we be in an hour?" she asked. Something moved in his eyes, warm and deliberate and full of intent that moved through her bloodstream like something slow and inevitable. "Somewhere that isn't a safe house," he said. He took her back to the penthouse. It felt different than the first night, the same space. Same floor-to-ceiling windows, same Chicago skyline burning behind the glass, same sandalwood and something darker air, but inhabited differently. The first night she had stepped off that elevator as a woman on guard, cataloging exits and reading threats and managing the inconvenient electricity of a man she hadn't expected. Tonight she stepped off that elevator as a woman who had been through something real with someone real and come out the other side of it holding his hand. Daniel poured 2 glasses of the same amber drink as the night before. He crossed to where she was standing at the window and handed her one and stood beside her, and they both looked out at the city for a moment. This city that had held both of them at a distance for so long that they had both navigated from the edges of, careful and contained and alone in their separate, disciplined ways. "My apartment," Zara said. "Is it safe to go back to?" "Tomorrow," he said. "Tonight?" He stopped. "Tonight?" she prompted. He took the glass from her hand and set both of them on the window ledge. Then he turned to face her fully, and the look on his face, open and warm and carrying none of the careful management she had watched him maintain across their entire first evening, made her breath change in her chest. "I meant what I said earlier," he said. "I need there to be something after this, something real, something that doesn't have an operational reason to exist." He reached out and ran the back of his fingers down the side of her face. Slow, barely there, the gentlest possible thing from a man who had told her he wasn't gentle. And the trail it left on her skin felt like being written on. "I want you in my life, Zara. Not in my case, not in my protection detail. In my life." She looked at him for a long moment. "I want to point out," she said quietly, "that we have known each other for exactly 24 hours. "I know," he said. "That's, by most reasonable standards, not enough time to—" "I know," he said again, patient, certain, that immovable Daniel certainty that she had initially found alarming and had somewhere in the last 24 hours begun to find. If she was being completely honest with herself. Deeply, fundamentally attractive. "And you don't care," she said. "I care about very few things in the conventional way," he said. "But what I feel," his hand curved around the side of her neck, warm and certain, his thumb at the line of her jaw, "is not something I'm willing to be reasonable about." Zara felt those words move through her from the point of contact outward, like warmth expanding from a center. She had spent 4 years being reasonable, being careful, being the woman who kept her walls at the exact height required to stay safe and functional and whole. She had done it well. She'd been proud of it. And then this man had looked at her from across a penthouse at 8:57 on a Tuesday night, and all of that careful architecture had started coming apart at the seams, like it had been waiting for exactly this specific, unreasonable thing to arrive and give it permission. She put her hand flat against his chest, their gesture, the one that was already entirely theirs. Daniel, she said softly. Zara. And her name in his mouth was still, even now, a completely different experience than she was equipped for. I stopped being reasonable about you, she said. Somewhere around the 3rd floor on the elevator ride up here last night. Something broke open in his expression. Not dramatically, just the last controlled thing releasing. His forehead dropped to hers and his eyes closed and he exhaled. Slow, deep, complete. And in that exhale she heard 8 years of carrying something alone, finally, fully, setting itself down. She kissed him first this time. Soft, then deeper, her hands moving up into the lapels of his jacket, pulling him closer, and his response was immediate and total. His arms coming around her, one hand pressed between her shoulder blades, drawing her flesh against him, the other sliding into her hair the way it had the night before, and the kiss moved from tender into something considerably more consuming within approximately 3 seconds. He walked her backward from the window. Slow, certain. The city blazing behind them through 40 floors of glass, completely indifferent to what was happening on this side of it. I need to tell you something, he murmured against her mouth. Now, she managed. Now, he confirmed. He pulled back enough to look at her face, both of them breathing differently than they had been 60 seconds ago. His hands were at her waist, warm and firm and present through the fabric of her clothes. I told you last night I'm not a gentle man. I remember, she said. I want to be clear. His eyes moved over her face with that total, consuming attention. The gentle and careful are not the same thing, and I intend to be very, very careful with you. His thumb traced a slow arc at her hip. With all of you. For as long as you'll allow it. Zara stared at him. This man, this impossible, complicated, fortress-built, shadow agency running, genuinely devastating man. That, she said softly, might be the most seductive thing anyone has ever said to me. I'm just getting started, he said quietly. And the way he said it, low and warm and carrying the specific promise of a man who meant every syllable, moved through her entire body like a slow, deep current that started at the base of her spine and radiated outward until she felt it in her fingertips. She pulled him back to her. What happened next belonged to them entirely. No folder, no documents, no Hartwell Group or shell companies or federal marshals or corrupted agents or any of the machinery of danger that had brought them to each other. Just the penthouse and the skyline and the long, unhurried hours of a Thursday night in November, during which Daniel Ashford proved. Thoroughly, attentively, and with a focus that made Zara feel like the only existing thing in any room that had ever contained them both. That there was indeed a meaningful and significant difference between gentle and careful. He was not gentle. He was extraordinarily careful. With his hands, which learned her the way they learned everything, completely and without rushing, with his mouth, which moved across her skin with a patience and deliberateness that made time feel suspended, that made her forget the city existed, that made her understand in her bones why she had picked up that drink the night before instead of getting back in the elevator like every sensible instinct she possessed had been screaming at her to do. He paid attention the way geniuses pay attention, completely, instinctively, missing nothing. Every sound she made, every shift in her breathing, every involuntary press of her hands against his skin. He noted it all and responded with the precise, devastating accuracy of a man who had decided that her pleasure was a problem he intended to solve comprehensively and repeatedly. There was a moment, somewhere in the long, warm dark of that night, when she lay with her cheek against his chest and his heartbeat under her ear and his hand moving in slow, absent circles at her back, and the city glittered beyond the windows like it was putting on a show, specifically for them, and she felt, wholly and completely and without a single remaining wall between herself and the feeling, happy, not relieved, not safe, not just satisfied in the immediate physical sense, though she was absolutely all of those things. Happy, the deep kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly but settles into the bones and stays. Hey, she said softly into the dark. Hey, he said. His voice was different like this, quieter, stripped of everything except what was actually him. Ask me something, she said. She felt him shift, looking down at her in the dark. "What do you want me to ask?" "Anything," she said. "I want to hear what you actually want to know about me, not the case, not the documents. Me." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What did you want to be when you were little, before numbers?" She smiled against his chest. "A marine biologist." She felt him laugh, actually laugh. Low and real and full, a sound she wanted to collect and keep. "Why didn't you?" "I'm terrified of open water," she said. The irony was not lost on me. He laughed again, and then he pressed his lips to the top of her head and kept them there while the laughter settled and the room went quiet and warm around them. "Your turn," he said. "What do you want to do?" she said carefully. "Now that it's done, the Hartwell case, your sister." She paused. "What does Daniel Ashford do when he's not at war?" The longest pause of the evening. "I have no idea," he said finally. And the honesty of it. The almost vulnerable admission from a man who always had the answer, made her lift her head and look at his face in the dark. "Well," she said softly, "I suppose we have time to figure it out." He looked at her. In the low light from the city coming through the windows, his eyes were warm and dark and completely unguarded in a way she suspected very few people had ever been allowed to see. "Stay," he said. "Not just tonight. Daniel, I'm not asking you to decide everything right now," he said. "I'm asking you to not run, to give this," he moved his hand between them, "the same patience you give everything else you believe is worth understanding." Zara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the elevator, the prayer she'd repeated all the way up, and how completely, utterly it had failed her the moment those doors opened. She thought about the folder, and the drinks, and the documents, and the safe house, and the back alley, and the shot that had cracked the silence of a Lincoln Park brownstone. She thought about his hand in hers under the table, and his mouth on her temple, and the way he'd said her name from the very first time, like it was something he intended to keep safe. She thought about being a marine biologist, and open water, and how the most terrifying things were sometimes exactly the ones worth swimming toward. "I'm not running," she said. He pulled her back against his chest, his arms wrapped around her completely. She felt his exhale, long, deep, settled, and pulled her own knees up and closed her eyes and let herself be held by the most dangerous man in Chicago in the most complete and uncomplicated silence she had experienced in years. Outside, the city burned with its 1,000 indifferent lights. Inside, something that had started in an elevator with a prayer and a burgundy dress and a folder full of secrets had become, against all probability, against every rule she had made for herself, against every wall she had built and every careful distance she had maintained, the realest thing in Zara Collins' 32 years of living. She wasn't afraid of it. For the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she was not afraid. She closed her eyes. She slept. And Daniel Ashford, who had not slept easily or fully in 8 years, lay in the dark with her weight against his chest and her breathing slow and even against his throat, and felt, for the first time since his sister, that the thing he had been fighting toward was not revenge after all. It was this. It had always been this. He closed his eyes too. The city held them both. The end.